The allegory of the cave. Next, said I, compare our nature in respect of education and its lack to such an experience as this. Imagine this. People live under the earth in a cave-like dwelling. Stretching a long way up toward the daylight is its entrance, toward which the entire cave is gathered. A bunch of people sitting down there, okay? The people have been in this dwelling since childhood, shackled by the legs and neck. Thus, they stay in the same place so that there is only one thing for them to look at. Whatever they encounter in front of their faces. But because they are shackled, they are unable to turn their heads around. So all they're looking at is this wall. Okay? The prisoners down here that are shackled and chained, they can't see anything behind them. All right? A fire is behind them, and there is a wall between the fire and the prisoners. Some light, of course, is allowed them, namely from a fire that casts its glow toward them from behind them, being above and at some distance. Between the fire and those who are shackled, that is behind their backs, there runs a walkway at a certain height. Imagine that a low wall has been built the length of the walkway, like the low curtain that puppeteers put up, over which they show their puppets. So now imagine that all along this low wall, people are carrying all sorts of things that reach up higher than the wall. Right? You see this little guy holding something. I think it's an orange. I tried to draw an orange. Or a statue of an orange. Statues and other carvings made of stone or wood, and many other artifacts that people have made. As you would expect, some are talking to each other as they walk along, and some are silent. So there are a bunch of people walking here with various things. They're going doo-doo-doo-doo-doo. And the fire is casting a shadow of the objects on the wall in front of the prisoners.
This is an unusual picture that you are presenting here, and these are unusual prisoners.
They are very much like us humans, I responded. Why would he say that? What do you think is going on here after having read the story? They are very much like us humans. Yeah?
Like we are only presenting a certain image that people want us to see. So our job to free ourselves from nothing and go beyond what we know.
What kind of images are you talking about?
Like in life, like with politics and higher up people, like we're shown different, I don't know, like whatever's on their agenda for us to stay under their control.
Ah, okay. So there are image makers in our society that kind of determine what we see. Yes? And there's a lot more here going on than just that, but that's an important part of it. The very basic idea is, look, none of us have a complete understanding of reality. Okay? Our understanding is limited. We only have so much information available to us. In some sense, we are all living in a world of illusion. There are a lot of things that we are mistaken about, a lot of things that we are conditioned into thinking and believing and desiring based on the kind of society environment that we've constructed for ourselves. So this is an unusual picture. But what Socrates is trying to drive home for us is that we are not unlike these prisoners. We are very much like them. We'll get into more of why that is the case in a bit. What do you think? From the beginning, people like this have never managed, whether on their own or with the help of others, to see anything besides the shadows that are continually projected on the wall opposite them by the glow of the fire.
How could otherwise? They're forced to keep their heads immobile for their entire lives.
Ah, okay, so there's something preventing them from looking around at the rest of the cave, right? All they can see are, well, what is shown them. And what do they see of the things that are being carried along behind them? Do they not see simply these, namely the shadows? Now, if they were able to say something about what they saw and to talk it over, do you not think that they would regard that which they saw on the wall as beings?
They would have to.
And now what if this prison also had an echo reverberating off the wall in front of them? Whenever one of the people walking behind those in chains and carrying the things would make a sound, do you think the prisoners would imagine that the speaker were anyone other than the shadow passing in front of them?
Nothing else by Zeus?
Zeus, yeah. All in all, I responded, those who are chained would consider nothing besides the shadows of the artifacts as the unhidden.
That would be absolutely that would be absolutely have to be. Or that would absolutely have to be.
Right. So think about exactly what's going on here. Imagine these people, these prisoners, have grown up in this cave. They know nothing besides the shadows on the walls and whatever sounds reverberate around the cave. What do you think they would do? Would they just sit there silent their whole lives? What do people do in their lives? Create meaning out of things. Maybe play games, right? Like, oh, hey, look, we've seen that before. That's the horse, right? Oh, yeah, a horse makes this sound. Maybe they would name the things that would come in front of them, right? Perhaps they would, set up some sort of social ritual or a way of life in which their entire being revolved around identifying the shadows and being the first one to understand what they are and name them. Try to figure out what the hell is going on, right? Imagine that these cave dwellers have constructed a way of life around what they are experiencing. Okay? Think about all the things that they would do, all the things that they wouldn't do. Naturally, they would come to believe that the shadows on the wall are what is real. That is all they know. They don't know anything else. They can't see behind them. They can't look to the sides. They have never been outside. But now imagine this. So now, I replied, watch the process whereby the prisoners are set free from their chains, and along with that, cured of their lack of insight. And likewise consider what kind of lack of insight must be if the following were to happen to those who were chained. Whenever any of them was unchained and was forced to stand up suddenly, to turn around, to walk, and to look up toward the light, in each case the person would be able to do this only with pain, and because of the flickering brightness would be unable to look at those things whose shadows he previously saw. Okay, so imagine somebody is set loose, okay, and he's able to stand up and he's able to look around. Well, what's he used to? His eyes are used to looking at the shadows, right, and identifying them. Imagine what it's like when you spend a long time in a dark room and your eyes adjust to that level of brightness. And then somebody, takes a flashlight and is like, ugh, shines it into your face. What would that be like for you? Would that feel good? No, what would you experience?
In the dark room, no dark, not no much light in this room, just bring a bright light in my face, like.
Right. Yeah. And you would feel pain, right? Your eyes would hurt. First of all, since you've been sitting your whole life, standing up would hurt, right? Your legs probably aren't very strong. So somehow this idea of being liberated from our mistaken understanding is painful. There's suffering involved in that. And that is going to be one of the key themes of this allegory. In some sense, what Plato is describing for us is what the journey to truth feels like and how that impacts us. Well, let's continue on. If all this were to happen to the prisoner, what do you think he would say if someone were to inform him that what he saw before were mere trifles, but that now he was much nearer to beings? And that as a consequence of now being turned toward what is more in being, he also saw more correctly. And if someone were then to show him any of the things that were passing by and forced him to answer the question about what it was, don't you think he would be at a wit's end and in addition would consider that what he previously saw was more unhidden than what was now being shown?
Yes, absolutely.
And if someone even forced him to look into the glare of the fire, would his eyes not hurt him? And would he not then turn away and flee back to that which he is capable of looking at? And would he not decide that what he could see before without any help was in fact clearer than what was now being shown to him? Now imagine this. If someone using force were to pull him, who had been freed from his chains, away from there and drag him up the cave's rough and steep ascent, and not to let go of him until he had dragged him out into the light of the sun, would not the one who had been dragged like this feel in the process pain and rage? And when he got into the sunlight, wouldn't his eyes be filled with the glare? And wouldn't he thus be unable to see any of the things that are now revealed to him as the unhidden?
He would not be able to do that at all, at least not right away.
Right. What is it like when you're in a dark room, or let's say you're in a movie theater and then at the end of the movie you go out the side exit? What is it like when you get out there, outside? You're like, oh, the sunlight hits you. You're like, it's too bright. Oh, I got to close my eyes. Yeah, there's pain. There's an intense experience that goes along with this. When we leave the cave, when we exit our previous understanding, it takes time to adjust to our new understanding. Right? We're not able to see things as clearly as we once were because we're not adjusted to that new mode of seeing and being in the world. It would obviously take some time getting accustomed, I think, if it should be a matter of taking into one's eyes that which is up there outside the cave in the light of the sun. And in this process of acclimatization, he would first and most easily be able to look at the shadows, and after that, the images of people and the rest of the things as they are reflected in water. So there are a lot of things going on here, but let me just give you this. When your parents are raising you into how the world works and what's going on, do they tell you the full truth right away? Are you capable of understanding the full truth when you're a kid? No, maybe when you're 4, you say, Mommy, Daddy, where do babies come from? And they say, well, when a mommy and a daddy love each other, they get married and then the baby comes. Right? And you're like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. And then later, as you get older, you start understanding how that actually works and how a baby is conceived and all of that. So when we start our journey to understanding the nature of reality, our society, what's going on, we have to start in some sense with crude approximations, with models, like they do in science, right? Think of Newton's 3 laws. We know that those laws work for normal objects, right? We use them all the time for tables, chairs, projectiles. But they're not totally true, are they? They don't work for the quantum realm. We need a whole other science, a whole other model or explanation in order to make sense of that weird shit. So, when we're on our journey to truth and understanding, we have to begin with crude approximations, and as we build our understanding up, it is only then that we start to obtain a holistic picture of what's going on, a deeper, fuller understanding of what all this actually means and how it works. So too with the prisoner who is dragged up the ascent. First, he can only look at the shadows. Then he can look at the reflections of things in water, say the reflections of trees, of squirrels, whatever. Later, however, he would be able to view the things themselves, the beings instead of the dim reflections. So I actually be able to look at a tree or a bush or the ground or whatever. But within the range of such things, he might well contemplate what there is in the heavenly dome. Okay, so We start off by looking at all this stuff, and then our eyes are turned upward eventually, right? We start looking up. More easily during the night by looking at the light of the stars and the moon. More easily, that is to say, than by looking at the sun and its glare during the day. But I think that finally he would be in the condition, eventually, after some time, after his eyes have adjusted, after his understanding has ripened, to look at the sun itself. Not just at its reflection, whether in water or wherever else it might appear, but at the sun itself, as it is in and of itself and in the place proper to it, and to contemplate of what sort it is. So there's a movement here. We start with the crude approximations, then the reflections, then we can look at the things themselves. Then we start inquiring into, how did all of this get here? What caused all of this? We start reasoning and thinking and engaging in contemplation. And having done all that, by this time you would also be able to gather the following about the sun. That it is that which grants both the seasons and the years. It is that which governs whatever there is in the now visible region of sunlight. And that it is also the cause of all those things that the people dwelling in the cave have before their eyes in some way or other.
It is obvious that he would get to these things, the sun and whatever stands in its way,
So think about the understanding that we have gained of our solar system, of our planets, of the nature of reality through observation and through reflection. Are not all of these things true? If there wasn't a sun in our solar system, would we be here? No, life would not have evolved on this planet as we know it. Maybe not at all, right? Plants require sunlight in order to survive. We require sunlight in order to warm the planet. It would be inhospitable if it wasn't around. But Plato is not just talking about the sun here. He's saying something a little bit deeper, more metaphysical, you might say. For him, the sun is a symbol for the first cause or the first principle of things. The reason that all of this is here and why it is the way that it is. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but just keep that in the back of your mind. As our understanding grows, as we sharpen our critical thinking skills, as we contemplate, as we reflect, interrogate, question, we come to a fuller understanding of the world, and then we start thinking about, well, how did all this get here? Why is this here? What really is going on? And then what happens in the story? Can anybody remember? The guy has been dragged out of the cave. He's able to adjust to the light eventually and see things as they are, and eventually to reflect on the first cause or the organizing principle of the universe. You could say he's become enlightened in some sense, right? He actually understands it. He sees it. He's like, oh my God, the cave, that was just a realm of illusion. I thought I knew what was going on. I've actually been out there. I see this stuff now. Like, I didn't know any of this existed. I understand it. Holy crap. Then what happens? Lily. And then what? If he again recalled his first dwelling and the knowing that passes as the norm there, and the people with whom he once was chained, don't you think he would consider himself lucky because of the transformation that had happened, and by contrast feel sorry for them? You know what this experience is like. You have an epiphany, you come to an understanding of the world, and what do you want to do? You want to share it with people. You want to tell your friends and your parents. And you want to help people with the knowledge that you've gained. Right? You want to lead people to the light just as you have been led to the light. And that's what he tries to do. However, what if among the people in the previous dwelling place, the cave, certain honors and commendations were established for whomever most clearly catches sight of what passes by, and also best remembers which of them normally is brought by first, which one later, and which ones at the same time? And what if there were honors for whoever could most easily foresee which one might come by next? Do you think the one who had gotten out of the cave would still envy those within the cave and would want to compete with them who are esteemed and who have power? Or would not he or she much rather wish for the condition that Homer speaks of, namely, to live on the land above ground as the paid menial of another destitute peasant? Wouldn't he or she prefer to put up with absolutely anything else rather than associate with those opinions, the false ones, that hold in the cave and be that kind of human being?
I think that he would prefer to endure everything rather than be that kind of human being.
And now consider this. If this person who had gotten out of the cave were to go back down again and sit in the same place as before, would he not find in that case, coming suddenly out of the sunlight, that his eyes were filled with darkness?
Yes, very much so.
If you have a bunch of people sitting in a dark room and they've been there for a long time, and then you come in from the outside, what are you going to be able to see in there? Anything? No, just darkness, right? Whereas the people who have been in there for a long time, well, their eyes are accustomed to that and they can see things. So our cave dweller has been dragged out of the cave. He's been shown the error of his ways. He understands what reality is like, but he wants to help those that he left behind, right? His fellow prisoners. So he goes back into the cave. But being used to the sunlight outside, having been illuminated from within by knowledge and reason, coming to a fuller understanding of things, his eyes are not adjusted to the dark. So he fumbles his way around, right? He's bumping into things. Now, if once again, along with those who had remained shackled there, the freed person had to engage in the business of asserting and maintaining opinions about the shadows, while his eyes are still weak and before they have adjusted, an adjustment that would require a bit of time, would he not then be exposed to ridicule down there? And would they not let him know that he had gone up, but only in order to come back down into the cave with his eyes ruined? And thus it certainly does not pay to go up. So he's not able to transition smoothly back into his previous understanding and his previous way of life. Why? His eyes are not adjusted for illusion anymore, and shadows, darkness, and ignorance. His eyes are adjusted to knowledge, to actual reality. And so these people think in the cave, they understand what's going on. They know how the universe works. They're playing their little games. Maybe they've set up a society down there. Maybe certain people are leaders, others are followers. And they pass the time by naming the shadows and predicting which ones are going to come next and analyzing them and figuring it all out. And our cave dweller comes back and he can't do any of that. Right? He can't see the shadows on the walls. His eyes, his mind is not adjusted for that way of seeing the world anymore. A mistaken way of seeing the world. And so he fails at all these games, right? Basically, they tell him, oh, so you went up there and you know reality now, right? Oh, let's see how you do. Remember the shadow game, bro? Let's see if you can play it. And he fails miserably, right? He sucks. He can't do it. And what do they say to him? What kind of response do they have? What do they do? They think he's dumb. They make fun of him. They laugh at him. Think about if somebody were to come up to you and they were like, I've awakened. I've had an enlightened moment. I understand the nature of reality. Let me tell you all about it. You're like, get out of here, crazy person. What the fuck are you talking about? Right? You wouldn't listen to a word that they would say. And if you did, in the back of your mind, you'd just be like, waiting for this to be over. This guy doesn't know anything. Right? Because you have an understanding of the world that you're attached to. You see the world in a particular way. You have a theory about how all this works, about where you came from, about how society should be, about what's right and just. We all have beliefs about these things, right? We think we know what's going on. And so in the story, they test him, and he fails miserably. So they ridicule him. And what do they say? Leaving the cave like this, you have messed yourself up. You can't live down here with us. You can't play by the rules. You can't see the shadows on the walls. You don't know what's going on. You're an idiot. Why the hell did you do that in the first place? It's not like it was his fault, right? He was dragged out of there, which we could talk about in a bit. But they think he's a nut job, right? They're like, there's no use in listening to this guy. And if they can get hold of this person, and who takes it in hand to free them from their chains and to lead them up, and if they could kill him, will they not actually kill him? So Socrates implies here that the end result of all of this, of somebody who has come to a fuller understanding of reality, is trying to communicate that to people who have a mistaken view of the world. Not only are they laughed at and then ridiculed, they are killed. Why would the cave dwellers want to kill this guy and the person who freed him? Why?
They're trying to destroy their illusion, what they know, think they know to be true.
Right. Exactly. Think of what happens when somebody comes up to you and confronts you with an uncomfortable truth. Do you happily accept it? You're like, oh yeah, my boyfriend's probably cheating on me, you're right. And you say, no, Greg would never do that. Fuck you. Right? You would get defensive. You would get angry. Because again, you have an understanding of things. You have a belief about what's going on. I've heard one thinker say that one way we could interpret this allegory is that everybody is basically sleepwalking. We are sleepwalking through life. We're filled with these ideas and these theories and these views and these values by our parents, by our education, by society. And what do you never do if you encounter somebody who's sleepwalking? Yeah, you don't wake them up. Why? You don't try to wake them up.
It's just dangerous. I don't know.
It's dangerous because they can get very violent very quickly. That's a very good image for what Plato is trying to say. Okay? And there are multiple interpretations of what's going on here, which we'll talk about next. But the basic idea is this. We are the cave dwellers. Not just the people out there who are working their manual labor jobs, not just your parents, not just Christians or atheists or conservatives or progressives. Everybody is a cave dweller. We are all stuck in the cave. Arguably, we could say we are all living in many caves right now. We don't have a complete understanding of what's going on. We don't have all the answers. Yet we cling to these worldviews and these beliefs. How often do we interrogate them and reflect on them? And if somebody comes to us with an alternative perspective, one that contradicts our own, our natural response is not to be loving and accepting and seeing this as an opportunity for learning and growth. It's to get defensive. It's to remain attached. Because that is what we know. And if we are shaken out of what we think we know, our whole world falls out from under us. Imagine somebody who has gone to church their whole life, and then in college they lose their faith and they become an atheist. What often happens to those people? They go through a depressive, nihilistic episode in their life. Their complete understanding of the world has changed. Everything they thought they knew, they think now is wrong. And that comes with a lot of pain and suffering and negative emotion. We are like that. We are stuck in our views. But that's not all that Plato is trying to say here. Okay? What's going to help us tease out some of the other interpretations is getting down what exactly all the things in this story are supposed to symbolize. Okay? So let's do that. What do you think the cave represents? We've kind of been talking about it. We've been dancing around it a little bit. If you have an answer, shout it out. Yeah. You could say it's society. It's how all this education and the market and our conditioning is constructed. You could say it's those echo chambers that you are a part of online and all those tiny Reddit communities that you're a part of, or that small number of people on Twitter that you follow. Right? So we could say it's society. We could say it's what's given to us through conventional wisdom. There's not really wisdom at all, Plato would say. But what's more than this is that Plato is making what we would call a metaphysical claim here. I told you last class that metaphysics is the study of the nature of the universe. For Plato, the cave isn't just our society, our education, our upbringing, the media we consume, and all that. It's also what you would call the material world of the senses. See, we live in these bodies. We experience reality through our sense organs, through our eyes, our ears, our nose, our mouth, our sense of touch. And a lot of people base their understanding of the world on these things, based on what they taste, hear, smell, touch, and see. But what's the problem with that? Have you ever felt a vibration in your pocket and you didn't actually get a notification? Have you ever seen something that wasn't there? Have you ever heard a noise in your room late at night? What the hell is that? And it's nothing. Just nothing. The senses can deceive us. People in the desert talk about seeing mirages all the time. Right? So we are living in this physical reality, and we're using our senses to understand and move around within it. But the problem is they are not completely reliable. They can deceive us. And so in some real sense, pun not intended, these are not completely reliable. Okay, so we can't use them to come to a certain understanding of how all this works and what it all is. Okay? But there's another part to this as well. I wrote here material world, or what you might call the physical world, of tables and chairs and laptops and atoms and waves and energy and molecules and all that stuff that science talks about, okay? For Plato, he doesn't think that this stuff is ultimately real. In some sense, he thinks that this physical world that we are living in, that is informed by space and time, that is organized by the laws of nature, that this is somehow less real than what is actually real. If we want to connect this to Eastern philosophy, we could say Plato thinks that this material world of all of these objects, all this stuff, is Maya. Everything is an illusion in some sense. All of this is not ultimately perfect, true, or real. And this is where his metaphysical view comes in. See, Plato thinks that there exists outside of space and time this completely separate realm called the realm of the forms, in which these ideas or concepts exist that basically are responsible for everything else existing. It's a very weird idea. It's very strange. But it's basically this. What is this thing right here that Connor's name tag is on? Huh?
Paper.
What is it on?
A table.
Table. Okay, yeah. What's this?
Table.
All right, yeah. What's the thing behind you?
Table.
Okay, so we know that all these three things are tables, right? How can we know that all of them are tables? They're not identical, right? If we took out a microscope and we looked at every inch of these tables, we'd be like, they're not the same. But yet we know that they're all a table. Similarly, what is this? And what's that? And that. Laptops, right? Or watches. Basically, one of the things that Plato thinks is we can distinguish things from each other and we can group them together because what makes that a table is that it participates in the form or concept of tableness that exists in this divine realm outside of space and time. And so what makes that a table is the fact that it participates in the form of tableness. What makes this a marker is that it participates in the form of markerness. There's a form for everything, okay? Including abstract things like beauty and art and love and goodness. These forms, in the Greek, what are called eidos, or ideas, but it's not just something in your head. I like to call them concepts. They exist outside of the realm of our physical world. They are eternal. They are perfect. But we can't see or smell or taste or touch them. The only way that we can get access to this realm is through the mind, through logical thought and philosophy. And so, why do philosophy at all? Well, Plato thinks that it actually gets us in touch with what is actually real up there, and it gives us insight when we are able to access this realm into what is actually going on and how all of this works. So the cave is this illusory physical realm that we are living in. We need to try to ascend mentally if we're really going to understand things. But he's also making a social, political claim here. He's saying the cave is also the society in which we live, the structures under which we are constrained, the education that we're given, and all of that. For the cave dwellers, we already talked about this. Who are the cave dwellers? Is it Joe Schmo out there on the street? Yes. Is it President Joe Biden? Yes. Is it me? Yes. Everybody is a cave dweller to some extent. It's just a question of scale. How much are you living in the cave, and how many caves are you residing in? Everyone is a cave dweller, at least until they start engaging in philosophy and coming to a fuller understanding of the way the universe actually works. So we could say here, cave dwellers are normal people. Or we could say everyone. Or we could say the cave dwellers are those who live and act without reasoning, reflection, introspection, critical thinking. Who's the escapee then? Yeah, keep going.
The person who decides to think outside of everything we know is educated.
Right. See, when I use the word philosopher in this class, I'm not talking about me who does this professionally. Anybody who pursues truth, who has a love of truth and tries to uncover it, that's a philosopher. That's what we mean when we say philosopher in this class. So, if you have a drive to understand how this works and why, you're a philosopher. You certainly think and act like a philosopher, at least sometimes in your life, right? When you're not scrolling endlessly on Instagram. But yes, the escapee is one who thinks, who reflects, who has this desire to understand, who pursues truth and wisdom. Doesn't matter what domain it is in. Mathematics, sociology, culture, art, government, politics, whatever. The escapee is one who has a love of truth. Right? That's where we get the word philosophy from. Love of wisdom, love of knowledge. And consequently, they're going to be somebody who reflects, reasons, tries to get to the bottom of things. In the cave, illusions abound. But we have to use our reasoning capacities and our other skills in order to question what we are told, what we are given. It's not enough to just accept every piece of information that is given to you. If you really want to understand what's going on, you got to think about that. And you have to research, and you have to investigate, and you follow the truth where it leads. True knowledge is not knowledge of this, of the material world, of what the Kardashians are up to. True knowledge is the correct, proper understanding of what the fuck is going on. That takes a lot of work. And it's painful. But Plato thinks it's worth it. And as we'll see, he thinks it's necessary if we're going to make the most out of this life, if we're going to be fulfilled, and if we're actually going to change things, if we don't like how things are going. Okay? So, I've given you kind of a few different interpretations. Let's get them down on the board. All right? There are multiple ways you can interpret what Plato is doing here. I'll start with a historical interpretation. What I'm going to call the indictment interpretation. Does anybody know the story of Socrates, Plato's mentor? He was a real historical figure. He died, we think, around 404 BC. something like that. About 20 years before Plato wrote this book. Does anybody know what happened to Socrates, what his life was like, what he did? He was the paradigmatic philosopher, okay? The guy. But a lot of people hated him. Why? Because he was kind of annoying. He'd come up to you and he'd be like, hey, I'm trying to figure out what justice is. Do you know what justice is? And people would give some answer. And he'd be like, well, have you considered this? This throws a whole wrench in your thing. And they're like, oh, fuck, I never thought about that before. No, I guess I don't know what justice is. And then he'd go on to the next person. Do you know what justice is? Do you know what love is? Do you know what's going on? What the hell is all, like, man, it's confusing out here. And throughout his life, he was somebody who questioned things. He questioned what the political authorities were saying. He questioned the Homeric morality and value system on which Greek culture was based. He questioned the morals of his time. He questioned the efficacy of the democratic system of government that Athens had instituted. He questioned, in some sense, the traditions, the conventional wisdom. And what did that end up doing? Well, it ended up confusing a lot of people, because he showed people where there were holes in their arguments and their understanding, and didn't really give them much, didn't leave them with much, other than, I don't know what's going on either, I guess let's think and talk about it. And that's basically what he did during his life. He philosophized. He thought about things. He tried to get to the bottom of things. And that upset a lot of people because it confused them, because, well, he ended up procuring a good deal of students, and the political authorities of Athens at the time thought, this guy's a rabble-rouser. He's confusing the youth. He's causing them to have improper views on the gods. He's causing them to question our authority. Democracy? All this stuff? This guy has to go. And so what did they do? They charged him with all these crimes, confusing and misleading the youth, causing people to question political authority, blasphemy against the gods. And they dragged him in to a trial. Socrates, being the funny guy that he was, basically said, you think that's bad? You should be giving me a house for everything I'm doing for this city. And they didn't like that very much. And they said, you are guilty of these crimes, and they sentenced him to death. And so the story goes, he willingly drank the hemlock and died. And what happens in this story? The person who discovers the truth and then tries to lead other people to it, what happens to him? He gets killed. Exactly. This picture mirrors what happened to Plato's mentor, Socrates. And Plato never forgot that. So one way we can interpret this is that Plato is basically leveling an indictment against Athens and against a society in general in which philosophers are dragged through the mud, hated, disliked, misunderstood, and killed, all because they're trying to figure out what's going on and do what's right. He's like, this is ass backwards. This is not how it should be. Athens is corrupt, lacking wisdom, and it killed my teacher for no good reason. This will not stand, man. You might think that would cause Plato to reflect on whether or not he's safe writing such a book as this. Whether he's safe just talking about philosophy of his friends. Maybe he's going to get offed just like his teacher was. We could say this is one of the great sins of humankind in history, at least from the philosopher's perspective. If you're somebody who was living during this time and engaged in politics, an aristocrat, a ruler, you might think, hey, getting rid of this guy was a good thing because he was causing us to lose money and power. But not from other perspectives. So what else could be going on here? Well, more historical context for you. This book, The Republic, was written after a tumultuous time in Athenian history. Has anybody here played Assassin's Creed Odyssey? What's going on in that game? Do you remember, Kelly?
It's like the collapse.
Right. And during this time, well, before the book was written, Athens and Sparta were at war. This is what's known as the Peloponnesian War. Does anybody know what the outcome of that war was? Who won? It was Sparta. They were stronger, better, whatever you want to say. Athens lost. They suffered a defeat by an enemy. And so one way we can interpret this story is that Plato is giving us kind of a political analysis, what I'm going to call the political interpretation. See, this whole book, The Republic, is trying to answer this overarching question of what justice is. And in order to do that, what Socrates and his other interlocutors do is they try to imagine what the ideal city looks like, what the ideal just community looks like, how that would be run, how that would be created and organized. And consequently, by looking at the image of an ideal utopian city, Socrates says we'll be able to see what justice looks like in the individual human person, how an individual can be just. And so what Plato is saying, I think, with this story also is the way that the Athenians have been organizing themselves socially and politically is wrong. It caused them to lose the Peloponnesian War. They were disorganized. They did not have proper rulers. They did not have proper military strategy, proper resource allocation. And what does Plato lay this defeat at? He lays it at the feet of democracy, poor political rule, corruption, and a way of life that is lacking in many moral and epistemic respects. See, Plato does not have nice things to say about democracy in this book. He calls it mob rule. Rule of the stupid people who don't know what's going on. In his ideal society, it's the philosophers who rule. The people who have no desire for earthly power. Actually, a big problem in the book is how do we convince these guys that just want to think all day, the smart people, to rule everybody? That's a problem that they have to solve at one point. So he thinks that this mess that they're in, with political instability, corruption, the loss in this war, is due to the way that they've been doing politics the last few decades. So that's another thing that he's trying to get at. If you're interested in this question of whether or not democracy is a good way to organize ourselves politically, read Jason Brennan's book, Against Democracy, in which he shows that, look, the majority of the people out there who are voting and who are electing representatives are stupid. They don't know what's going on. You're going to let dumb people decide the fate of the country? He's like, it's not very smart. And he gives a bunch of other arguments too. So, the idea is basically, Plato is saying, we need to organize ourselves in a different way if we want to build a better life for ourselves, if we want to defend against invaders, if we want to solve the problems that have crept into this system. We have to change things up. A transformation needs to occur both individually and socially, governmentally. But that's not all. We can take this in a few other directions. Another interpretation is the educational interpretation. Can you guess what this one says? Do you think Plato thinks the education in Athens is good? Obviously not, right? He's going to say there's something wrong with that. We got to fix that. See, because at the time, a lot of the young men who were later going to start participating in Athenian politics were going to this group of people known as the Sophists for their education. This is a big theme in the book as well, comparing the philosophers and the Sophists. The philosophers never work for any money. They just talk with people. They just try to figure out what's going on. The Sophists, according to the philosophers, they're not trying to understand real reality. They're just teaching you how to use words to get what you want, which is very effective in politics, right? Knowing what to say, knowing what kind of story to give, knowing when to cry in order to get laws passed and all that. So education is lacking. It needs to be changed. One of the reasons he thinks that they're in this mess is because people who were ruling leaned so heavily on this sophistic education that did not actually prepare them to understand what's going on. I've already talked about the metaphysical interpretation. The world of the senses is illusory compared to the perfect realm of the eternal forms that exists outside of space and time. But we'll list two more. And these are very important. The epistemic interpretation. This is where we see Plato's argument for the value of philosophy. True knowledge, true understanding does not come from just consuming what you're told and accepting it. It requires what he calls dialectic, which basically means having a conversation. It could be with another person or it could be with yourself. Basically, the dialectic is just thinking, either inside your own mind or out loud. Going back and forth. I think it's this way. But what about this? Oh, okay, then it has to be like this. Oh, but what about that? That is how we come to knowledge. Knowledge requires this back and forth, this questioning, this interrogating, this reflection. It requires reason. Not just trusting society. Not just trusting what the government says. Which leads us to our last interpretation. What I'm going to call the propaganda interpretation. I don't know how to spell today. Excuse me. What do you think this interpretation says? We've been dancing around it the whole time. Yes, Lily.
Like people, like higher up people or people with the office who basically just want to see what is going to benefit them in the long run.
Right. What's another way of encapsulating that? Brainwashing is everywhere, and we are all victims of it. And there are a bunch of different domains in which this occurs. What is parenting except glorified brainwashing? When you have kids, you want them to believe what you believe, to hold the values that you hold, right? To understand reality as you understand it. And so you're given a particular worldview. That's what you're fed. You're told what's wrong and what's right, what's true and what's false. So we've been brainwashed since we're little kids, whether that's into a religion, or a political ideology, what have you. So there's parenting. There's education. See, in order to get an education in this country, you have to have somebody introduce you to things, walk you through things, right? Teach you things. I have biases. I have my own worldview. Do you think I'm going to share something with you that I am pretty sure is absolutely false? So the information that you're receiving is filtered. And that should cause you to actually reflect on what I'm teaching you. Because I could be way off. I could be wrong. Maybe I should be one of those professors who deliberately tells you lies and see if you can pick up on it. I'll try not to do that. But your education is filtered, right? It's constrained. How else are we influenced and informed? How about by government? The government gives us certain messages about what's right and what's wrong, what the state of the country is like, whether or not we should worry or not worry, and people eat it up, right? Doesn't matter what side of the political aisle you're on. How about media? Is everything you see on CNN true? How about Fox News? How about MSNBC? No! The media is just a giant business. Telling the news is secondary to making money. So you better bet your ass you're getting a filtered, limited story. You're being fed what they want you to see, which will boost their ratings. How about advertising? We are constantly surrounded by all these images that are trying to get us to buy things, to want things. And we can also talk about religion, ideology, other forms of dogma. All of these things give us particular frameworks and stories with which to view the world that are limited. And so propaganda surrounds us. Now there are three responses to this, and this is where I'll leave you. All of this should cause you to reflect on whether or not you are living in a cave in your own life, which caves you might be living in, the ways in which your understanding and knowledge might be constrained, the factors that have led you to have the worldview that you have. How might you respond to this idea that you have been brainwashed in all these areas of your life, you don't really know what's going on, you don't have a complete understanding? Well, there are three things that you can do, at least. One, you can become an activist. If you recognize that the system is not serving you, that it is feeding you a false story, you can try to change it and you can try to wake other people up. Or you could be what I call here, and I just chose these terms kind of half-assedly. You can be an individual. Instead of trying to change the system, you change yourself so that you can better deal with what life throws at you and what the system throws at you. But there's a third possibility as well. This is one that is common in Eastern philosophy and was common during some periods of Christianity, which is known as quietism. Instead of trying to change the world, or instead of trying to change yourself to deal with all of this, you can just let go. You can go with the flow. You can give up attachment, desire, and preference altogether and accept completely what comes at every moment of your life without reservation. So, the takeaway is this. In some sense, we are all living in a world of illusion. We have a mistaken understanding. We're not given the complete picture. What are we going to do about it? Are you content living like that? Are you content just accepting what others tell you, whether it's your parents, your church, the government, the media, advertising? Are you going to actually think about this stuff? Do you want to live your life as a mindless automaton, in Fromm's words? Or do you want to be somebody who actually thinks and investigates for themselves? Plato wants to push us towards that latter option. Because it might be that the fate of the individual and the fate of society depends on it. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Any questions? Comments? Concerns? Okay, I'll see you all next class period. Thank you all for coming. Next week I'll start taking attendance.